You bet.
Everybody, welcome to this, the second Ask Starbaby Anything episode. Starbaby, good to see you. Thanks for coming back to join us. How you doing?
Fine. Happy to be here.
Excellent. We had some really good feedback of the last AMA, and in fact, it felt like this was the third AMA we did. I don't know if there was another live stream we did. Well, one of the problems we had in the last episode was some audio issues. So I would just say up front to everybody at home who's listening, if there are any audio issues, then ping a message into the chat, let us know. You should be able to hear everybody okay. We've done a double check on that beforehand. And if you have any other issues around sort of what we're doing, then leave a message. We've got two people. We've got Nux and we've got Exchequer, who are in the chat presently, who are helping to farm questions from the chat and send them to us. But they're also there to help with any issues you might have. So part of the feedback we got on the last episode actually came from some mates of Starbaby's, which was that my 5-minute intro was just excessive. And I think it's just they want to listen to him talk more. Or maybe he fabricated that feedback. I don't know. Maybe he wants to talk more. At any rate, I'm going to make this expedited. So what we're going to do is I do want to say thanks quickly again to Jax. Jax, the Chief Meme Officer at 10% True. It is him who's put together this fantastic background. Thank you very much for doing that. Thanks also to Nux and to Exchequer, who I've just mentioned. And I think Scotty might also be joining at some point to help with farming those questions. The purpose of today's conversation actually is quite Ukraine-centric. We're going to start with a story, which is the usual beginning. So that's going to be Starbaby telling us something that will hopefully entertain and inform. But we're then going to go through the Ukraine update, and then we're going to talk about this Royal United Services Institute paper that has been released this week. It talks about Russian air power over Ukraine since the February invasion, and then we'll ask the AMA questions for the Ukraine. So on our Discord channel, people have already posted some questions. If you're listening to this and you want to post some questions for Starbaby, we will try to get to them. I can't promise we will, but if you've got Ukraine related questions, get them in now, because then we'll have an interlude where I'm going to show a video from a mate of the channel. And then we're going to get to talking about some other things, some more generally military aviation related things, such as the fact that we've got British pilots and maybe American and Australian pilots too, helping the Chinese learn how to fly fighters. And then we'll have some more AMA questions on general mil aviation topics at the end. So there you go. I think I did that quite quickly. I don't think there should be any complaints that I've talked too much at the beginning. Why don't you tell us a story?
All right. So, no shit, there I was. I was asked for an FNG story. And if you don't know what FNG stands for, you're going to have to look it up. But it means new young person. How about that? So, this is the rare nav school sortie. So, in nav training at Mather, the aircraft, our primary trainer was actually a T-43A, the Gator. And the T-43A is a 737-200. So that's the 737 airliner you're all familiar with the kind of long cylindrical engines. It looked like you took a mini submarine, chopped off the front and the back end, and stuck it on the wing. And so that's what the 200 looks like. And in the back of this are 12 student stations, which are all identical and they're all repeaters. And you can face forward or backwards. And they're all tied to the navigational radar in the nose. And we've got a couple sextant ports for those poor bastards that had to learn celestial navigation. Did you know that a sextant port on a T-43 is exactly the right size to blow a hard-boiled egg out of at altitude? I'll bet you didn't know that. But it is. And hard-boiled eggs come in the box lunches. That's why we know that. We, speaking metaphorically, of course. Anyway, so this is our trainer. And what we do, it was Mather Air Force Base, it was in Sacramento. We had a number of routes that go out to the northeast or to the north or to the south, and they're just navigational training routes. And what you actually had to do is you divide the sortie up into chunks so that during one of these chunks, one student is telling the pilots what to do on the flight deck, and the other students are monitoring their position because they're not cooperating in any way in order to get this done. And so there I was, and we're flying Corners 4, I believe. And Corners 4 is a route that goes straight out to Nebraska, turns around, and comes back. And there is nothing, once you get east of Crater Lake, there is nothing out there to make this easy on you. There's no nice radar navigational points. There's no lakes. There's no rivers. There's no big cities. I mean, it's a whole lot of nothing. And, like, steer do not show up on navigational radars, although the fence lines designed to keep them in sometimes do. So we're out there, and my instructor is not feeling good. He should not have been flying that day. And the flight might have been a little bumpy. And I'm out there and it's not my turn. And so I'm just kind of watching what's going on. We've got 2 degrees of right drift. I've got this nailed. I know exactly where we are. And so I can lean back and not pay attention to what's going off. And in the meantime, we penetrate a frontal boundary, which means it gets bumpy. And that puts my instructor over the edge. Okay, he's feeling ill. He's got some gastrointestinal distress. And now we're hitting a bunch of bumps. And he pretty much says to me, hey, you're on your own for this. And I say, okay, I mean, whatever. And in the meantime, those bumps, why do we have those bumps? Because we're passing through a frontal boundary. And so my drift goes from 2 degrees in one direction to the right to 13 degrees in the other direction while I'm not paying attention. And so it gets to the point where we're up to my time, and I realize that I have completely misplotted the route, and I could be tens of miles off. But we got one fix we could use we kept a log of everything. We could do one fix off a navigational aid, and I hadn't used my fix yet. So bang, I nail my fix. I get my new position. I figure it out. We turn around, and we start heading for home. My turn up at the front, on course, on time, we're rocking. And I managed to pull out a save. Well, because my instructor's out of there, he's not overseeing me. I then erase my whole log with all the entries where I wasn't paying attention and put new entries in so that it looked like I had been paying attention all along. And we land, and he says, yeah, I'm not even going to debrief. You're responsible for your own grade sheet. Like, great. Okay, now, so that's a blank check. And if you're going to give me a blank check, I'm going to use a blank check. So the grading goes from 0 to 4. 0 means you busted the ride. If you get a 0 in any category, I gave myself a bunch of 4s. And in the comments, I wrote, best navigator since Ferdinand Magellan. Because why would I pass that up? And of course, he gets the grade sheet later, and he sees this, and grade sheets are all filled out in pencil. And so he erases it and writes something new. Except that this is on carbon paper. So it's 2 grade sheets with carbon paper between it. Okay, and in the rewriting, the carbon paper, the original, which is the one that says, I'm the greatest navigator since Ferdinand Magellan, that stays. And that's the one that goes into my records with the instructor's signature at the bottom because I didn't sign it. I just filled it out. So there we go. Starbaby as a new guy doing really what I think you would expect.
And it only got worse from there. You've got to tell your story. Not now, but the Starbaby is a challenge to command. I think that was the phrase that you said. A general officer who was, I think, friendly with you.
Oh, absolutely. That's General Holmes. General Mobile Holmes, F-15 C model driver, saw the light and went to dark grays. Endangered his career multiple times by agreeing to hold my leash. He held my leash in Afghanistan for a couple of times as my boss at Air Combat Command. And that's how he described me, was I am a challenge to command. And he was also explaining to another officer that I'd been in the Skunk Works with. And he said, yeah, you can't make Starbaby do anything he doesn't want to do. Okay? But fortunately, the things he wants to do are good for the Air Force. But that's true. And that's why it's such a miracle that I actually ever made 06. Is because it's very difficult to get me to do something I don't want to do.
Well, luckily for us, you want to talk about Ukraine, so it's a win-win situation. Tell us, what have you seen in the last month then?
All right, so the big news. Let's work backwards. The big news is the Ukrainian army has recaptured the city of Kherson in the south. They may not have all of it, and they may not have fully cleared it, but they're there. The flags are up. The flag went up over the municipal building this morning before Ukrainian soldiers got in. And from watching this at a distance, the biggest delay for the Ukrainians entering the city appeared to be all the people coming out to hug them. It's still going to be a clearing operation because the Russians no doubt left behind booby traps and mines. But that's the big news. The other big news, I think, and we're going to talk about it later, is the RUSI guys, Royal United Services Institute, which I think is the oldest continuously operating military think tank in the world. They were started by the Duke of Wellington in 18 something or other. Um, they put together a pretty good list of what the Ukrainian air war looks like, and in terms of fighters, bombers, helicopters, missiles, and what Ukraine needs. So that feeds into this week's picture is that we now have from the Ukrainian side, from interviews with the Ukrainians, I think a better picture of Russian Air Force operations. And what we appear to have learned, what Rusi teased out from the interviews, is that the Russians are flying more sorties, more fighter sorties than we thought they were. They're flying combat air patrols, two ship caps during daylight hours with MiG-31 Foxhounds, later model upgraded Foxhounds at that. So the MiG-31 BM and Su-35s. And there are apparently 6 to 8 lanes or zones where those aircraft are flying over Russian or occupied Ukrainian territory, and they're looking for Ukrainian aircraft. And they are taking long range, and it looks like very long range shots, and appear to have bagged about a dozen Ukrainian aircraft. MiG-29s, 4 of those, 5 Su-25s, 1 each fencer and flanker. That may not add up to 12, but I'm close. And so the Russian Air Force is still in the fight. They're just not necessarily going in the fight up close for ground support. The other thing we found out, which was very interesting, is that the Russians were trying destruction of enemy air defenses. Now, we discussed a couple episodes ago when we were talking about Russian air power ops in Ukraine, we talked about the fact that the Russians are shooting anti-radiation missiles. And they are. And they're shooting anti-radiation missiles from the MiG-21s, possibly from the Su-35s. It might be tough to tell. But they are definitely having some limited effect on Ukrainian forces. But they have been trying destruction attacks where the fast jets would fire the anti-radiation missiles to try and suppress the radar, and the Su-25s would come in low level with a load of unguided rockets, jack their nose, and fire off the rockets, like we've seen videos. So these are unguided rockets, and their chances of hitting something the size of a radar are pretty close to zero. And in fact, there have been no damage of any kind against an air defense system attributed to those attacks. That's just your that's your unguided artillery barrage from an airplane kind of move. So it's interesting to see that despite the fact that I slammed the Russians early for not having a real campaign plan, which I think is still true, it doesn't mean they haven't been trying to execute what you would expect them to execute in terms of suppression of enemy air defenses. The fact that they haven't been particularly great at it doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have had it all their way. Both sides have successfully killed other sides' radars. I think the Ukrainians are more successful at it, but it's hard to tell. And it's going to be harder to tell until the Ukrainian army overruns a bunch of wreckage and we get pictures. It may be that people with satellite imagery and good satellite imagery have pictures already, but I'm not one of those people. In terms of helicopters, we still see helicopter activity on the front, both sides, but the Russian Ka-52s have been getting hammered. And one of the things I had not thought about, we'd seen it. We'd seen a couple of videos of Ka-52s getting shot down by anti-tank guided missiles. And that's great. I love it. Those are the Stukhnas, the Ukrainian-built anti-tank guided missiles, and they've got 2 kills on the Ka-52. I hadn't realized why the Russians are hovering, and that's probably because of their beam rider missiles. If they're moving, they will lose track on a beam rider, and I'll explain that later when we talk about attack helicopters. So, big picture, the air war is still going on. The Russians are still using cruise missiles. They are still using the occasional ballistic missile. They have shot probably 400 of the Shahed drones that they got from Iran. and they've done a lot of damage to electrical power infrastructure. And so, what we're seeing in the battlefield that is genuinely new is the advent of the low cost cruise missile. Now, it's painful for me to admit this, but Air Force Research Lab had a project called the Low Cost Cruise Missile about a decade ago, and it failed because they couldn't get it to low cost and they couldn't figure out what militarily useful thing they could do with a low cost cruise missile with a 40-pound warhead. And of course, the Russians have that challenge too, but since they're not targeting military targets, they don't have to worry about what military use you get of a 40-pound warhead. It's what damage you can do to a civilian target. Totally different equation. And they did not go with a jet, and they just accepted a drone from the Iranians with a 40-kilo warhead and let it do its thing. So we're seeing the first of the low-cost cruise missiles. We're also seeing the Russians increase their use of loitering munitions, where they're actually flying these things under remote control into their targets, and they're using hunter-killer teams. So they will have a drone up that is just providing imagery, and they will get a target and they will fire a loitering munition at it and pretty much guide that into the target through the data link, where the operator is actually looking through the seeker on the nose of the weapon. However, I've seen them get a number of hits, and they claim they kill a target. They've been hitting things. They have not necessarily been killing them. So if they hit the side of a T-72 turret, it looks good and it makes a cloud of smoke, and it probably does jack. We saw that effect with loitering munitions in Armenia 2 years ago. I also saw them hit an SA-11 Telar with it. Telar had 2 missiles on. Clearly, the operators knew something was going on because the missiles kept coming up, going down. The radar is, the vehicle is rotating. They've got the radar searched, but they don't see this guy come in from the side. It hits the side of the turret. And what happens? Nothing. Nothing apparent. It does not cook off the missiles. It does not get a catastrophic kill on the vehicle. I don't think it did the radar any good because there's a bunch of black boxes, about in the part of the turret which they hit. But an entirely repairable hit, I think. It's certainly a mission kill and a firepower kill, and one that may take weeks to repair, but it's not causing a catastrophic cook-off. So more small munitions, more of the autonomous munitions, and a lot of low-cost cruise missiles because the expensive cruise missiles are almost certainly running very low. What else can I say?
Tell me about for a moment, we obviously concentrate quite a lot on the channel around technology and not so much tactics, but the application of air power to warfare. But can you talk a little bit about military ethics? One of the comments that I saw in one of our previous videos, which I think is perfectly valid, and I think you acknowledged it, was that in the Balkans in the 90s, going after electrical infrastructure was one of the things that NATO did. Obviously, the Russians are going after electrical infrastructure wholesale now in Ukraine, and it's having a significant impact on the civilian population. But is that a valid target? Does it have a military application?
So it can be a valid target. Let me throw a distinction between NATO's targeting. When NATO attacked energy, part of the electrical energy system, the attacks were generally aimed against the distribution and not the generation. So power generation is hard to build. It's hard to repair. It's hard to rebuild. Distribution is, also easier to destroy. But if you bring power lines down, or if you cause damage to a transformer station, NATO tried to minimize the amount of damage that was done so that the time period for repairs would be measured in days or weeks, or even sometimes hours. So that's different from going after generation capability. Power generation can be a militarily valid target if the power is being used to power something of military value. So, for example, if you have an air defense system, a control and reporting post, a bunch of radars, and yes, they have all generators, but they would prefer to not run the generators all the time. They might want to pull off the grid. And if you separate them from the grid, you're attacking the power infrastructure, and that's completely legitimate. Okay, you're separating the the military units, the actual green painted objects from the military grid, force them on the generator power, force them to burn fuel. Totally legitimate. Um, if you are hitting the heating system for a town, which has no military utility, isn't supporting the Ukrainian military, or if you hit a city where it's just you're going after power generation, that's a lot more questionable, and that becomes um, that can it's not an easy cut and dried targeting decision, but with all your targeting decisions, you still have to tie it to some kind of military gain that you are trying for. And it's very difficult if you have a power system that is not supplying military elements, then that's very, very hard to justify that as targeting. Heating, I mean, heating the town steam plant so that nobody has heat, that's not valid. And going after water supplies, that's not valid. And that's actually a war crime. That's pretty much unambiguous. So there are times when you hit a rail line. If you needed to isolate a rail line because it's an electric rail line, again, that's kind of second order military effects. If the rail line's moving men and material, then if you hit power to cut off power to a rail line so they can't move it, totally legit. So it can be a step or two removed. That's kind of the big difference, though. If you're using it as a terror tactic to deprive people of heat and light, that's a war crime.
Well, it's one to add to a list of many that's growing by all accounts. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this RUSI paper then. So you already gave a brief summary, and I would recommend, if I just quickly, I don't need to do this. I'm just doing it because I can. I would recommend that everybody here goes and reads this. It's a fantastic report. It's by Justin Bronk, who people will probably be very familiar with him. He's been fairly omnipresent, I think you would say, throughout this conflict, and is a great speaker, erudite, and seems to really have a good handle on the topic. And as Starbaby mentioned, he has actually been to Ukraine with Nick Reynolds and Jack Watling, or maybe one of them did, I don't know exactly who went, but they went to Ukraine and they've interviewed people. This is not just a sort of open source experiment. They've actually gone and talked to these people. So it's a really good read, and I think in many respects it backs up what Starbaby has said in previous episodes around low-level tactics and the reasons for those, and what has transpired. But it does tell a good story around the initial 2 days. It talks about how the Russians did have a plan. They used electronic attack, they used decoys, they managed to score kinetic kills on ground-based air defense systems. A lot of static stuff, old SA-3 stuff, I think they talk about, static early warning, sort of search radar sites, that kind of stuff. And the Ukrainians were in some instances a little slow to move their SA-11s, SA-8s, and get them sort of out of the line of fire, let's say. But it talks also about how after that sort of 2 day period or so, there's some electrical fratricide going on, where the Russian army is trying to advance. The electronic attack that they've used successfully in the first 2 days is now jamming their own forces, and how the VKS, the Russian Air Force, is being retasked to support those guys on the ground rather than to go out after the Ukrainian Air Force and ground-based air defense systems. And so I got a couple of questions, Darby, I wanted to ask you about what's contained in the story thereafter. Air launch decoys. So they talk about an air launch decoy, which I highlighted a bunch of sections, and I don't remember which one it's called, and I can't remember what the air launch decoy is called, but I Googled it, couldn't find anything about it.
I couldn't find anything either.
So I was going to ask what you know about it, but do you have anything in the back of your mind from your...
The Russians prior to 2008 had a lot of crappy drones and reconnaissance drones that had been converted from target drones. And they didn't work worth a darn over Georgia, and that is what started the Russians on their modern drone path, was seeing Georgian Hermes drones, Israeli built, sold to the Georgians, looking down at the Russians. The Russians had no equivalent, and they had nothing that could do anything about these drones. So the Russians ended up with a whole bunch of crappy jet-powered drones, and I suspect that those were used as decoys. There were a couple examples of what appeared to be drone wreckage recovered in the first days, but it did not appear to be a massive barrage. Um, it did not appear to be the equivalent of the Scathe Mean effort that opened Desert Storm, which was an American use of high-speed target drones to simulate aircraft. So I'm not sure how much they actually used in terms of decoys and how, if at all, they fooled the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians did, I mean, we saw very early on, I saw burning Talking and thin skin radars, and Talking is fixed. I mean, once you set that up, it's going to be there for the rest of your life and the rest of your children's lives. It's not even remotely transportable. They have to have guy wires to hold the antenna up. It's so big. Really long range, though. But we even saw the truck and trailer mounted stuff. But one of the things that the Ukrainians told Rusi was that it was the SA-10P batteries. It was the parts of those batteries that couldn't move because they were in a repair status, so they didn't have spare parts. That's what got caught early on. And so it's very much like what we saw against the Serbs in 1999 is you give the air defenders an opportunity to flush out of the garrison and go to work, and they're going to flush out of the garrison and go to work. That's exactly what Ukraine did.
One of Ukraine's responses to this, then, and I found this curious, was for air defence and ground-based air defence to deconflict by time. And I was thinking back to Desert Storm and all the conflicts that I know of, at least, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but sort of time has not been a way of deconflicting. You know, there have been safe return routes. Let's say you need to fly at a certain altitude at a certain airspeed, squawking in this channel, and then you won't get bagged by your own side. And I guess sort of time relates to the switchover of mode 4 codes and that kind of thing. You need to be squawking this after midnight, and before the midnight you need to be on this, whatever. But obviously, and the Ukrainians seem to have been a little coy about this, but they had some blue on blue as a result of that. So is deconflicting by time a valid way to do that? Should they have known better?
No, deconfliction by time is fine. And when you talk about a transit route or a low-level transit route or a safe passage zone, um, those are often open and closed based on times. So time is routine. If you activate say a FEZ, a fighter engagement zone, that is activated in an area for a specific period of time. So this is all normal NATO airspace coordination order stuff. Is you activate an area of the airspace for a specific time. It's not necessarily permanent. So you set up your air refueling tracks. They might last for a long period of time, and they're always active because you've always got a tanker in them. But I can bring up and bring down my fighter engagement zone or my missile engagement zone or my low-level transit route or my safe corridor or any restricted operating zone. Those can all be brought up and brought down and done by time. So it's completely legitimate. And to some extent, the Russians are doing it too, because they're flying your combat air patrols during the day, apparently. But at night, when they don't appear to be flying caps, don't think that that airspace isn't covered by a missile system. Hmm. So I suspect that both sides are using time. Yeah, just make sure your watches are synchronized.
Tell us about then this sort of technical overmatch. You already sort of referenced it in terms of shot ranges in excess of 100 kilometers from the MiG-31s, but Su-30 and Su-35s also have this technical overmatch as well. They are apparently shooting from not dissimilar distances. And it sounds to me it's a bit like the Ukrainians had the R-27, the Russians had the R-77, which is the fully active radar-guided missile. It's a bit like an AIM-7 versus an AMRAAM fight. I know you won't spill any secrets, but how do you deal with that technical overmatch? I mean, you know, the article kind of references going in low and using some sneaky tactics to maybe negate some of that, difference in weapons engagement zone or missile engagement zone. But broadly speaking, what do you do about that?
So that's hard. Broadly speaking, is you stay out of the weapons engagement zone is your best bet. All right, so the missiles. Let's talk about dueling missiles. The the Ukrainians have the R-27, which is NATO codenamed Alamo, and that is a 80s kind of missile. Not bad. Comes in infrared and uh, radar versions. Comes in short range and long range versions as well. And those missiles are kind of like a Vietnam era AIM 7E. They're boost only, so they're pretty quick out of the gate, but they don't have a sustainer motor, so they don't maintain their kinematics for a long period of time. The missile I think we're worried about on the other side is the R-37, R-37Ms, which is the AA-13. What do they call that? The asshole. Okay, so the AA-13 asshole is the missile that the MiG-31s and some of the Su-35 Sierras are carrying and shooting from long range. It's actually NATO code name is Axehead. My NATO code name is better. It just shows you how things would be different if I were in charge of NATO code names. So they have a missile that its claimed range without the supplementary booster is 200 kilometers. And in terms of the radar, they have a late model NATO codename Flashdance. I can't remember the Russian name for the radar. It's this giant radar, and this was the first phased array radar stuck in a fighter in the Flashdance when it went into the early models of the Foxhound. This has been upgraded. Big antenna, a lot of power, and big antenna, a lot of power makes a lot of difference. The predecessor aircraft was the MiG-25, and its radar Foxfire, and some modes of the Foxfire were so powerful they were considered impossible to jam. Not just difficult, impossible to jam. And so now you have a modernized version of a MiG-31 up there with a big antenna, a sophisticated radar, and a long-range missile, and it's a tough combination. How did the Ukrainians respond? They responded by going low. And it doesn't matter what the range of the missile is if the guy's radar can't see you because you put a hill between him and his radar. Okay, so remember that if your shooting airplane is a long way away, that graze angle plus curvature of the earth means that you don't need a really tall mountain to hide behind when you're the potential target down here. You can hide fairly well behind relatively low hills if you're low enough to do it. It's all about the graze angle, and you can do the math. That adds in a disparity because now Russian missiles are coming down from on high and the inferior range Ukrainian missiles are going up. So the Ukrainians really have no return shot option. And so there's no possibility of a missile duel. And that is a bad position to be in. So the way to handle that is to assess what you really need to do in terms of going into that missile engagement range from the combat air patrols and decide again if you really need to do that thing because you're in a disadvantage. The second part of your question, I think, AMRAAM versus AIM-7. So the AMRAAM has a specified size and weight. Why is that? And the answer is the AMRAAM is sized so you can fit it on the wingtip launch rail of an F-16. Which did not originally have a radar missile. And then when it got the Sparrows for the air defense version, they went under the wings. But the wingtip, that's, 325, 350-ish pounds. That's what the wingtip can handle. And remember, it's not the wingtip handling the missile sitting on the ground. That's easy. It's the wingtip handling the missile when you're pulling a bunch of Gs. So that missile gets very heavy in an F-16 when an F-16 starts pulling Gs. But that defined the weight of the missile. And so that missile then defined the form factor of the F-35 and the F-22's internal weapons bays because they're stealthy and they want to carry their stuff internally. Which means that for 20 some odd years, we've been stuck on an AMRAAM airframe, which is a limited weight and a limited size. And honestly, the designers have done very well. The latest model C7s are much farther range capable than the early model alphas. But you're still stuck in this form factor, whereas both the Russians and the Chinese, they're carrying their missiles externally. They can make them huge. They can pretend they're Hughes Corporation and they're building the Phoenix missile for the Tomcat, and they can have this giant kind of space launch vehicle hanging around on their swing wing. Um, that gets you something. You don't need to have a lot of finesse when you have a big ass booster, and you're launching from on high. So that's a disparity that not only the Ukrainians have to deal with, but the Americans are going to have to deal with,
Mm.
because the design of the missile was set for a certain point, and then it's kind of constrained forever after because of the weapons bay dimensions of your other fighters, which is another reason why the F-15EX has so much potential, is the potential to go back to a much larger air-to-air missile. And I would love to see what can be done with a Sparrow airframe, which Hornets could carry. I imagine Super Hornets still have some provision there somewhere, but maybe not. What can you do with a new rocket motor, new flight control laws on that? The Japanese built a version of the AIM-7 called an AA-4 Bravo,
Mm.
and that differs from an AIM-7 that it has an active radar seeker in the nose. So we know that things can be done. But the U.S. Air Force in particular has not been willing to follow that path because they locked themselves into a mindset that they haven't been able to get out of. And this is an important lesson to learn from the disparity between Ukraine and Russia. The positive side is Ukraine is not Israel. It's not always backed up against the ocean. And so they can use a little depth to try and stay away from long range Russian missile shots, because those aircraft are not coming into the Ukrainian weapons engagement zones for the Ukrainian surface to air.
Another disparity comes from a system I was not familiar with. A Podlet K1 is what it's described as, and it's this very long range, maybe sort of quite coarse resolution search radar, early warning radar. I don't know exactly how you define it, but apparently it has a 600-kilometer detection range, and it can detect targets up to 15 feet in altitude. I'm mixing metrics there, but that's what I've read. And what Justin and his colleagues are saying is that this system has the ability to feed S-300, S-400 missiles with target data as they come out of the apex of their launch. So they're launched in a sort of lock-on after-launch mode, and this thing can point them in the right general direction of the target. So I had two questions about it. What do you make of that? Were you familiar with it? And two, Bronk and his colleagues talk about there was one in Belarus and one in Crimea. Why weren't they taken out sooner?
The one in Crimea was, in fact, hit very early. I don't know what it was hit with, but I've got photos of its blackened chassis. So what this radar, and I don't know the NATO code name or even if one's been assigned. It's a truck-mounted radar on a mast that is kind of like a billboard, and it's a billboard on a stick with a light bar underneath it, because there's IFF in there as well. There's the secondary array. It's no different from a clamshell on a stick, which was a low altitude detection radar for the SA-10 and its follow-ons, or the tin shield on a stick, which can also be put up on a mast. So you put your radar up on a mast and you get better look down. But this is where you can run into a problem when you say, oh, it goes down to 15 feet or 15 meters. Yeah, sure it does, if you're 7 kilometers from the radar. So you still have curvature of the Earth, you still have terrain flow. But this is the normal progression for how you would handle acquisition on an S-300 or its later models. Is you've got a radar that's looking at some distance, and in the original design, it would have been a Big Bird radar battle management. And the Big Bird radar would assign tracks to an individual battalion. And so a battalion in Russian terms is a missile battery. And it has its own tin shield acquisition radar, has its own clamshell low altitude acquisition radar. It has its own flap-later tombstone engagement radar. And you just hand down from radar to radar till you get to the engagement. So there was a little bit in the Rusi paper, there was a little bit of fuzziness as to how this function actually goes. But this is just a new acquisition radar. Yes, it's better than older acquisition radars, but it's still subject to curvature of the Earth. You can still defeat it with low altitude, and it still is not really in the right band to necessarily act as a target tracking radar in and of itself. Um,
It's S band, isn't it? From memory.
yes, that's exactly right. So S band for NATO guys is Gulf band, that kind of area, and it's where you would see your long range surveillance radars like AWACS.
Hmm.
And so, without knowing more about how the radar, how big the resolution cell is, it is possible that you could use it as a targeting source to target an active missile so that you're lofting an active, but that's going to be a low probability of kill shot because you're expecting the teeny tiny uh, radar on the nose of that missile to pick up all the slop in a look down environment that your big radar wasn't able to do because the radar has a resolution cell. It's so wide, which is defined by the beam width, so high, also defined by the beam width, and so long, defined by the pulse length. And as you get farther away and you need more power to detect a target, your pulse length tends to get longer. That's without me having to discuss pulse compression. But let's just say that your pulse either gets longer or it acts like it's longer. And because you just need to put some energy into it. It's just the amount of energy you can put out in order to get a return at long range. And so that means you've got this almost like a rectangular solid that is a big uncertainty volume. And so that's a tough thing for even an advanced missile to pick up because it's got this teeny tiny radar that's that big around to try and do the search in the end game. So I would consider it very doubtful if the radar is magically seeing through trees and hills and stuff to enable low altitude targeting of Ukrainian aircraft. I think that the Ukrainian aircraft that were downed by long range shots were line of sight targets. They were higher.
Speaking of higher, one of the things that was in the article was the reference to the A50, the mainstay, I think it is.
Mainstay.
So that's their AWACS, and its susceptibility to electronic attack and jamming, and the fact that it's been largely irrelevant because of that. Does that surprise you? Does that tie in or tally with things that you had learned before about that particular platform?
Yeah, so it doesn't surprise me at all because when you're looking at the mainstay is kind of a copy of early E3s. And so the Russians and also the Ukrainians built a number of jammers. And they still have them, by the way, designed to target AWACS and designed to bring down that. So they had the high power. They were in the right band. Both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, started this fight with jammers designed to take down an AWACS. I think they'd eat a mainstay for lunch.
Yeah. Okay. So one last question then, and then we'll move on to the AMA questions that have been asked. Aircrew fatigue. So they talk about the fact that there have been some losses for the VKS, and we're 8 months in now, 9 months into the conflict, and aircrew fatigue is probably having an impact. It may have been attributable to some of the non-combat related mishaps that they've had of late. There was that video, I think, of a MiG-31 going off the runway. There's the Su-25 taking off and rolling into the dirt. There's been various indications that there are potentially some issues going on there. Maintenance is the other question, but I wanted to ask about fatigue particularly. When does fatigue start to kick in that kind of environment? How long can you survive on adrenaline for? I'm reminded of, I interviewed Cluzo Tellini on this channel about his planning for the Eagles during the Desert Storm 1991, and him saying he didn't have enough time, so he just sort of turned a week into 8 days, and he sort of trick fucked the numbers, if you will. So everybody was working really hard, flying really hard, and fatigue became an issue. But what's your view on that? How would you expect the Russians to be handling aircrew fatigue issues?
Badly. So let's take fatigue in two chunks. So the first chunk is acute. And when does it start? Fatigue starts when you wake up in the morning. So for a typical fighter mission, the Air Force rules are you have a 12-hour duty day from the time you wake up in the morning to the time you have to have the engine shut down. Now, yes, I know there are 14-hour sorties, so that there it's waverable, but that's the basic peacetime standard and wartime standard, unless you have to go on a really long range mission. And then there is crew rest, and crew rest is what happens before you show up at the squadron, and you need 12 hours of crew rest. You're out of the squadron, and of those 12 hours, 8 hours you have to have the opportunity for 8 hours of uninterrupted rest. So that's the short term stuff. And that's why when you look at Air Force mishaps that might be related to fatigue, aviation mishaps, you'll find that if there is a fatigue contributor, it's usually because one or both of those rules has been broken. The second thing is long term fatigue. So, long term fatigue, this stuff just wears you down. And so in Desert Storm, uh, there was a lot of, I want to say not problems, but difficulties with the 117 guys. You did not have enough 117 guys really to support a well rested force. And so they were flying night after night after night. And they're also getting reliant on the go pills. And go pills are stimulant. They are 10 milligram pills of dexamphetamine issued by a flight surgeon in small numbers, and they terrify me. In almost 500 combat hours, I've taken 2 half tabs, both for night combat air patrols where it was just dead ass boring. And so that is not the best way of managing fatigue. So when the Air Force learned, when we pulled into Allied Force, the Strike Eagle guys, and set up our composite squadron down in Aviano, we put guys on a fly 1 out of every 3 day schedule. And our schedule was fly day 1, you are supervisor of flying or mission planning cell. Day 2, day 3, you generally head off. And that was it, because we did not know how long that fight was going to last. And so you can keep a 1 out of every 3 day flying schedule going on forever, particularly if you're deployed and you don't have to deal with the family issues. You don't have to make sure the phone bill gets paid. You're just on somebody else's base in a 4-star hotel, because we are, after all, the Air Force, and flying once every 3 days. So I doubt that the Russians got anywhere near that. They didn't plan for a long war. And so I think that there is some acute fatigue going on and long-term fatigue beating down the air crews. And they're going to make mistakes. And I would bet that MiG-31 running off the edge of the runway was a guy that landed long and fast because he was freaking tired and no longer had the brain cells to realize he should have gone around. The other thing, and I'll tell you this, so at Allied Force, our commander was Dan Leaf, Fig, great guy, Viper pilot, really good general. He went on to make 3 stars, and he was a good dude then too. He took off one day. He's got 2 Mark 84s hanging under the wing, 2,000-pound bombs. He goes out, goes into a dive to drop his bombs on a target. Neither of them come off. He now has to bring the aircraft back heavyweight on a wet runway and land it, which he does. And he taxis back, and the safety pins had not been pulled. That's why the bombs did not release. And so instead of tearing a strip off somebody, and because I was there in the debrief, and General Leaf just said, we need to make sure that our arming crews are getting more rest.
Wow.
So that applies to the maintenance side of the house, and the weapons loader side of the house is, if those guys are worked too hard, guys and gals are worked too hard, and they will start making errors. Because despite what guys say, there is no working through fatigue. You don't pump yourself up and feel manly because you're a professional athlete and you've been playing football in high school, and by God, you fly the F-15C and you're going to just power through fatigue. The fuck you are. Okay, people like that die. Or they're very, very lucky. So you can't power through fatigue. And the Navy has realized belatedly that you can't power through fatigue after they started running ships into each other. You can't power through fatigue. And that means you need to have a fatigue management program, and I'm confident the Russians don't.
Fig, actually, he's got a channel, I think, where he interviews people, a bit like this, really. Probably, I was going to say better, but that would be disrespectful to you. Better when you're not on. But he talks a little bit about some of his experiences, and I think one of the stories he told was when he lost the brakes in an Eagle on taxi, and I think he must have had, I don't know, he lost nose wheel steering, he lost the brakes, he lost everything. So he flew the source, he came back, and he thought he was going to die, and it was only through miracle that he didn't. I think his wingtip hit an F-16, and that turned the F-15 just enough that he didn't then plow into another F-16. So, but he thought he was going to die. He seems like a nice guy anyway. All right, let's get some questions going from the audience. What I'm going to do is just take some questions from Discord first, and while you're answering them, I'm going to look around and see what Nux and what Exchequer have done in terms of adding any other questions from the live audience. But Casimir asked, Stuart B actually asked whether if NATO became involved in the conflict, it's likely that Russia has kept anything up its sleeve to perhaps catch NATO out. What do you think?
No, I don't think that not tactically. Technically, they're not going to be holding stuff back, waiting for NATO to show up. You play all your tricks when Cowboy Hughes and I planned the second night strike in Oberver Airfield. We didn't hold back any tricks for later. We pulled back every trick for that strike that we had learned in 1,000+ hours of fighter aviation each, and we played them all up front, and it worked. And so that's the way I expect the Russians. There might be some more reserve modes on the electronics that are held back because they haven't had a need to use them, and that's what I'd be more wary of. They might have abilities to take longer range shots than they actually are. So they might not have flashed all their underwear when they didn't have to. So just because the Russians are taking a 100-kilometer or 100-mile air-to-air missile shot doesn't mean that they're taking those shots at the maximum aerodynamic range. So there's always a possibility that you haven't seen, and a likelihood, in fact, that you haven't seen everything the enemy can throw at you. But tactically, I don't think they're holding anything back.
Casimir had asked, and one of the things that is in the Russia report, which we haven't touched on, and well, this is the opportunity to do so, is around rotary aviation. So he had asked whether or not there's much, or what it is that the West could be taken away from seeing the rotary aviation fight develop. If you were an Apache or an Army helicopter pilot, what would you be thinking?
I'd be thinking, don't stop moving and stay low. So I've seen a number of films of helicopters get bagged from a number of sources. And the Rusi report breaks down, of course, you got your Mi-24 Hinds, and you got your Mi-28 Havocs, and then you've got your Ka-52s, which, of course, the Russians call an alligator. The Ka-52s are taking it on the chin. And those are the ones where the losses are definitely higher, not counting the 3 that had demolition charges planted in them at an airfield in Russian by Ukrainian special ops, or presumed Ukrainian special operations. So guys that aren't moving quickly guys that are hovering are the ones getting killed by the anti-tank missiles. Guys that aren't moving quickly give a gunner plenty of time. Guys that go high altitude, I'm seeing SA-11s, Ukrainian SA-11s engage helicopters. That should never be happening. You should never have a Russian helicopter high enough where you're potentially within SA-11 range that system can bag you. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it can get, the SA-11 can get pretty low, and the Russians have always advertised a home on helicopter mode. But if your line of sight to an SA-11 is still a line of sight weapon, you are way too high. So you have to stay moving, and you have to be low, and those are keys. There are other technical things that the Beam Rider, we talked about the Beam Rider missiles, so I'm going to use the analogy so people understand it. So a laser-guided bomb, or something that is a semi-active laser, has a seeker in the nose of the weapon, and it's looking for the reflection. So the previous analogy I used was your cat is a semi-active laser seeker. You take your laser pointer, you put it against the wall, and your cat's going to follow that little spot all the way around because its receivers are its eyes. It sees the laser spot, it goes back. A beam rider is backwards. The seeker on a beam rider is in the back of the missile, and it's looking for this long line, and it tries to stay in the middle of the line. And the operator with the beam rider just needs to keep it pointing at the target. But the operator needs to be pretty much stationary in order for that to work. The advantage of the beam rider is that it can't be jammed. The disadvantage is, again, you have to have a pretty close to stationary shooter. And the way I can explain this is you have a lightsaber, and I'm going to give you an extra long lightsaber. And you know those when you hang a tire by a rope from a tree to make a swing? You're going to stick your lightsaber through that tire and you're going to poke the tree. And as long as you don't move, you can see and you don't touch the tire and nothing gets hurt. The moment you walk, your lightsaber moves off to the side and now you slice through the tire. The tire is the seeker, the aft-looking seeker for the missile. Once you cut through the tire, it can no longer see the laser beam or your lightsaber emitter, as the case may be. And that is why the Russians, who use both radio and laser beam rider missiles, are proving that that is just not a good anti-tank system.
And that's
Also,
that's the main
flares.
weapon for the K-52, isn't it? So that's one of the
It's yes, it's also for the 28, and could be for the Hind unless they're using older wire guided systems, which they're still technically capable of. And now that I know that the Russians are issuing World War II helmets to conscripts, I'm never going to assume that anything is out of the inventory. And I'm amazed. Can you imagine how much money the Russians could have made on eBay by selling genuine, unused Red Army helmets from 1945? They'd have made a mint.
yeah could have
And they've been
afforded to have
sitting in
made new
storage
ones.
somewhere. Yes, exactly. They could have afforded new ones because there's plenty of people out there that would have, oh, yeah, great, I'll buy this on eBay. Morons. See, if they were capitalists, they'd be in better shape.
So Ustio had asked on Discord a similar question, so I won't go through all of it. But at the end, he had asked about sort of the Kiowa warrior and sort of the hunter scout type scenario between the Kiowa and the Apache. And I was trying to remember, and I'm showing my ignorance here, what the cause was for such high, in relative terms, losses for the Apaches in March 2003. Because that was a force that had been, the U.S. Army Apache force had been optimized for killing armor, I guess, in sort of Central Europe, and was now fighting a threat that was in an urban environment. And I'm trying to remember whether or not they lost quite a few because they were moving around or because they weren't standing off. Do you remember what lessons
Yeah,
they learned
so
from that?
there were a couple things. One, they had trained for European environment. And this I'm all getting from reports, right? I didn't fly helicopters, and as we all know, I missed Desert Storm. So I'm looking at reports that may not capture the whole picture. But the first is that they had trained to fire from a hover. But more important in the case of the Apache losses is that doctrinally the Army had not let gone of the idea that they were going to do deep interdiction with their helicopters and they were going to go behind enemy lines, like potentially 100 miles behind enemy lines, and they were going to schwack something. And they tried that, and they lost Apaches doing it because it was a bad idea to surround yourself when you're at low altitude. Even if you're moving, you're relatively slow. Surround yourself with people shooting at you and see what happens. What happens is you're going to lose aircraft. And they did. The difference that I am told between the Sea Cobras that the Marines flew and in Desert Storm and the Apaches that the Army flew in Desert Storm was that the Marines never got below 90 knots. And of course, they didn't do deep interdiction. So speed matters because it takes a lot of your ballistic gunnery out of the question and kind of reduces the time that a gunner with a more advanced system has. The other aspect remember that the longbow Apache has that mushroom on top of the rotor that contains the longbow radar. That's designed for a European conflict. So the average tree height in Europe is like 80 to 120 feet. And you would just pop your mushroom up above the tree line and paint your targets and then launch a bunch of radar Hellfires, long-fire variant Hellfires, over the tree line where they could lock on after launch based on your radar painting it. And you had a data link, so you can pass only one guy, and the foreship needs to pop his mushroom, so to speak. And he could feed off targeting data to everybody else. So if you design yourself to function that way, where you're spending maximum time in cover, minimum exposure, and keep your speed up, I think things will go much better. And those are all lessons learned from the Gulf War, certainly.
Okay, we are an hour in, and I'm aware that we've still got. I mean, there's loads of questions in the general Mill Aviation AMA, so I want to try and zip through some of these. Then, so Crazy G-Man's asking, do you think there was incorporation of harm and HIMARS, where harm sorties would be used to help suppress enemy air defense, to help follow up HIMARS strikes?
No, I think it's backwards. I think it's entirely possible that rounds were fired at targets with harms kind of ready behind them in case the Russians brought up their radars to deal with the HIMARS. This is purely supposition on my part. The Russians claim to have downed HIMARS, but I've seen no evidence of it. And the Institute for the Study of War said last week they've seen no evidence for it either. But even if the Russians were trying to bring their radars up, we call it stimulating the threat. So you throw your missile or, your wild weasel in first, see if the radar comes up, and then toss the harm, not the other way around.
So no preemptive shots then?
If your timing were really good and you had a good idea on what your target radar was and where they were, you could try a preemptive shot.
Okay. There's lots of questions. So let's see what else we've got. Jing Zhang has asked a couple of questions, which I think we covered in the last episode. So around the difficulties of intercepting drones, low-level drones, and that kind of stuff with an IADS. I think you talked about that last time. So, Jin, I would say go back and watch the last episode.
But I'm going to hit that again.
You want to hit it again? Okay.
I want to hit it again because of what we're seeing the Ukrainians do. So, the missile duel, the missiles will still work against your relatively low. So let's talk about a drone at 1,000 feet cruising in, and I'm talking about the Shahed 131, 136 type of cruise missile-like drones. Those are worth a missile, and the Ukrainians will use it. But we're also seeing a lot more gun-based operations. And the 35 millimeter rounds from the Gepard, the German anti-aircraft tank, have apparently been eating the Shaheds for lunch. That's based on Ukrainian reports. So that is the best gun-based anti-aircraft system they have. It shocks me because the ZSU-23-4 Shilka should work within its range for that kind of environment, but it may be a radar limitation. It may be that the radar is just not living up to that. And I would have expected the Pantsir-based stuff, SA-19, SA-22, to do well, but of course, those are mostly on the wrong side, aside from the captured ones.
I was reading that they need to change the barrels on those Gepards, though. I don't know whether or not they are getting the sort of logistical support they need to be able to continue using them. I don't know if that's true, but okay.
Yeah, so probably 1,000 rounds. They need to change the barrels.
Yeah. Okay, so Andrew's asking about when it comes to avionics and switchology design, do you have any insight on who decides? Okay, so I think this actually is a general question rather than a Ukraine question, so we'll come back to that, Andrew. Neuropilot wants to know, are the Ukrainians getting any more MiG-29s or Su-27s from other sources? And he's asking whether or not there's any donated Su-30s. You any intel on whether or not they've been bolstered in any respect?
Nobody is talking about it, but the deals are still being offered. So there's this. The Dutch just came up this week and said, we'll pull some of our F-16s out of storage and give them to people if they supply MiG-29s. To Ukraine. So there is still there are still discussions going on about moving aircraft forward, but whether or not that has actually happened, I have no idea. But that's what I'd expect. If the MiG-29s or Su-27s or anything else moves forward into Ukraine, I don't expect either side to say a darn thing until the war is all over.
Okay.
Because there's no benefit to saying it. There's no benefit to giving the Russians better numbers, and there's no benefit to admitting that fighter aircraft are being supplied to Ukraine.
Jester's asked why Russian Soviet doctrine always seems to shoot two missiles. There's that video. I don't know if it's representative. It was released by the Russians. It shows the Su-35S with rippling three R-77s against a single target by the looks of it. around about 70-kilometer range. I don't know if that's a deception to release that, or if that's just something that they shouldn't have done. But that was a ripple of 3 missiles. What do you know doctrinally then about the way the Russians do business in that regard?
So I had to ask this question myself as to whether or not it was hardwired into like the MiG-29 and the Su-27. It's not apparently hardwired. So you can shoot one. Doctrinally, you shoot two. And the simple reason is it increases your probability of kill. So US, we tend to do a shoot, look, shoot fighters. But every guy has a brief, that they will brief their instructional brief says, these are the times when you go shoot, shoot. And if you are not facing the onrushing, hordes of Soviet or People's Liberation Army Air Force, then you don't need to conserve missiles, and shooting two will always get you a higher PK, and you want to paint that symbol on the side of your airplane. So shoot two. PK is probability of kill. Sorry if I skipped over that.
Okay, and I thought I saw a question about R77 somewhere in here. Let me have a quick look. Yeah, okay. I thought somebody had asked about an R77 in the chat, and I can't see it. So we'll take one more question on Ukraine, okay, and then we'll move on. I think. Let's see what we've got. We'll go to the Discord just to try and make it even. So Yeti 1980, he'll ask a what if type question. But supposing Ukraine comes out of this in good shape, how does it go about securing itself from future attack, and in particular, how would it go about rebuilding its air arm?
All right, so that's a great question, and I knew we were going to get to that. So there's been a lot of ongoing discussion. It happens every week. Why don't we give F-16s to Ukraine? Why don't we give F-15s to Ukraine? So the two-part question is, this is not easy. And transitioning from a Soviet design aircraft to a Western design aircraft is doable, but it is not easy. And the Poles did it from MiG-29s to Block 52, I believe, F-16s. It took them 10 years to get that done. The Finns did a very rapid transition from MiG-21 with the big engine to the F-18s, but they also they went the generational step and to the Western in one shot. So they never had MiG-29s. They didn't have the things they needed to unlearn or anything like that. But the important thing here is we know that Ukrainian aviators are talented. We know that they've had some degree of Western training, and the ones that are still around are obviously pretty good at their jobs. One of the reasons that Red Flag exists, in fact, the primary reason that the Red Flag series of exercises exists, is that what the Air Force found after Vietnam was that the majority of aviators that had been shot down on their first 10 missions. And so Red Flag gets you through your first 10 missions. Well, now you have a situation where you take a fighter pilot experienced in his MiG-29, you transition him to an F-16 in Arizona, you send him back out. When do you send him back out? If you send him back out when he graduates from the formal training unit, he's got 80 hours. And it might as well be as if his 10-mission clock is going to start all over again. I would not, at 60 hours in the Strike Eagle when I showed up at Lakenheath, I was not the same guy that I was with 500 hours in the Strike Eagle a year and a half later. And so that time makes a huge difference. So the short term is that we're probably better off to follow two tracks. One is to feed the machine with the Russian-built and Russian-designed systems, and the second is to separate out some Ukrainian aviators who are going to train on Western aircraft, and that we don't expect them to be combat ready for 3 years. And I'd work two tracks. And I think that the funding stream for that Congress has passed in the latest National Defense Authorization Act, but I don't know if it survived conference. The other thing is the question is, okay, well, we're going to have to transition them to Ukraine to Western anyway. What aircraft would you pick? Is it the F-16? Is it the Gripen? Is the Hornet? I'm going to say initially it's none of those. It's a combat variant of the T-7, which is the Boeing trainer, the red tail. And the reason I say that is because that aircraft has a significant amount of excess capacity. It is very fighter-like. But the second reason I say it is that Ukraine has an aviation industry that they are able to build. They built aircraft, they build avionics, they have that infrastructure there. It's been damaged. And I think that if they were essentially the manufacturer, if they were to license build combat variants of the T-7 for their own use, they're getting all the bang for the buck. They're getting a Western designed, modern aircraft capable of defensive counter air once you go to a fighter version, and they're getting to build it using Western techniques. And the T-7 is built with what's called non-monument manufacturing, meaning you don't need an assembly line.
Yeah.
And so that's the way, if I were doing a rebuild, I would do it, because I'm not only concerned with let's get the Ukrainians better Western gear, but also what does the Ukrainian industry and aviation industry look like, at the end of the war, a year after the war, 5 years after the war. And so I would take a totally different path and just focus on shoveling used Western aircraft at them. I think there's an opportunity here.
Okay. Well, I think we, at an hour and 10 minutes in, I think we can move on, or we should move on rather, so we don't end up busting too badly through the 2-hour mark. There's a ton of questions for General Mil Aviation, as I referenced earlier. But I would say to everybody who's listening and who posted a question that didn't get answered, don't be disheartened, because we actually, on the Discord channel, we have a separate thread. I don't know how he does it, but he does do it, where if we will dump the questions that didn't get answered into it, and Starbaby will come along over the course of whenever is convenient for him, next week or two, and he will answer your questions. But he'll do it in text rather than in person. So don't be disheartened if you ask a question and we didn't get to it, because I'm pretty sure, existing commitments notwithstanding, that Starbaby will come onto the Discord server and try and answer those questions for you.
And I'm every bit as funny in text as I am live.
I just love that you said to me when we first met, you said, I don't do social media. I'm not going to go on Discord. I don't do that. And now you're probably the most active person. Actually, our Discord's I know I'm teasing. Our Discord's really good. We've got, we were looking, or someone was on the Discord was looking at a competitor's Discord channel recently, and they said, God, they got loads of members, but it's dead. There's no conversation going on, and we've got tons of good stuff happening. So anyway.
It's just text communication. Just like texting on my
phone. That's just your get out for saying I don't do social media, and then saying that's not social media because it's just text. That just means that, like me, you're old.
That is also true.
It doesn't mean you don't do social media. Anyway, all right.
Yes, it does.
So now, listen. There is. I'm guessing there is somebody called Sedlow listening. Actually, Sedlow is a really big supporter of the channel. He's been one of the earlier supporters. He makes contributions all the time, and I wanted to be able to just pay back a tiny bit for his support over the last few years, and he's really active on Discord too. He is. I don't know what he does actually. His day job. I think he might be listening to this, and if he is, hey Sedlow, how you doing? But he is, in his free time, a mission designer for the DCS combat simulation series, and he has put together a bunch of free content in the form of the Bold Cheetah F-18 Hornet campaign, and I've played a few of the missions. They're really, really good. He does them as freeware, which means you don't have to pay for them. And if you're not a DCS fan, I apologize if this bit's a bit boring. Go make a cup of tea, or use the bathroom or whatever. But I want to play the 2-minute video that he has put out there for the Bold Cheetah campaign. He's also got a BFM trainer, which is also free. And once we've finished this conversation, I will put links to both of those in the description. But please show him your support. He's great because not only does he do this stuff, but he also then fixes bugs. So when people come in and comment and say, well, it was great, but I found a bug, he'll go in and fix it. So I'm going to play that video. It's only 2 minutes, and we'll consider this the interlude. Enjoy.
Attention on flight deck. On choosing one. Jose 1, we need those rounds on target ASAP. We're taking 80 casualties.
Goose 1-1 farm gun.
All stations, back you. AAA tracking at 23622.
Wizard to all players, Bogey, Keg 315 for 8, Angels 18, now southbound.
Uzi 1-1, splash 1.
Let's go.
Uzi 1-1, rifle.
There we go. Impressive. Sedlo, thanks for your support. I hope that you get lots of traction with the campaign, and everybody's listening. If you're into DCS, please go and grab that. Show your support to Sedlo. So, on the topic of interludes, I'm going to say my usual spiel, which is that I can see 120 odd concurrent viewers at the moment, but only 66 likes, which is not the ratio I was looking for. So, hey, if you are enjoying this content, it's free. It's not behind a paywall. There's no adverts other than that one for Sedlo, which I think is well deserved. And your appreciation could be expressed quite easily by hitting the thumbs up button if you like it. And if you don't like it, genuinely say why. What is it that you would expect to see? What is it you want to see? How could we improve it? And obviously, you can't say, well, you could go away and just leave Starbaby on his own, because that wouldn't really work. It's my channel. Although he is the star. So, all right. So, and you're muted, by the way, Starbaby, so people can't hear you laughing at me, which is good. So, on to the next topic, which is, if I get rid of that and bring this up here. Oh, this is the Bold Cheetah campaign page on the DCS website. I should have brought that up earlier, but I didn't. Okay. Anyway, so the sort of wild card conversation then with you, Starbaby, today is going to be around this news that came out a couple of weeks ago that British RAF fast jet pilots and some helicopter pilots apparently have been training the PLAF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, I believe, Chinese Air Force, how to fly their fast jets. I think it's a sort of training pipeline thing rather than a frontline thing. I don't think they're teaching it the FTU or the RTU or the B course or the OCU, depending on which country you come from. They're not teaching them how to take sort of J11s or J20s and be sort of combat effective, but they're teaching them the basics of how to be a fast jet pilot, which I guess and maybe even WISOs and navigators too. So they're the building blocks. So I guess if you get those bits right, then the chances are you're going to be much more able to spend time thinking about how to be a good sort of tactical fighter pilot or whatever. So, from my point of view, I wonder, some people say, well, they're not really teaching them how to be fighter pilots, but actually, yes, they are, and they're teaching them a mentality and presumably infusing them with some of the things that have taken us a long time to get right. At any rate, that's the story. I read recently also that there has been an American in Australia who's been arrested under a sealed arrest warrant, which means we don't know why, but he has apparently been for some years teaching the Chinese the same sorts of things, and there's even the possibility that some Australians are involved in it too. One of the forums that I go to, which is the PP Rune website, which is is kind of interesting. There are a few ex-RAF fast jet types on there who say that this has been going on for years, and the British MOD has known about it for years. So there's some depth to it as well. And I was going to suggest, this is where I get a little bit sort of on my soapbox about some things that aren't really relevant to this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I was going to suggest going and watching, for anybody who's interested in a breakdown of the PLAF and their training pipeline and the way that they train their fighter pilots and their fighter aircrew. I was going to suggest going and looking at the Millennium 7 History Tech channel. They've got a video. He's a great guy, this guy. I think he's an aerospace engineer. I think he's from Italy. I've learned so much from watching his channel. But I was going to suggest going and watching this, and then I noticed there's just, it's a 25-minute video, and for less than 2 seconds, this is on the screen, which is that the basis for the video is by a journalist called Andreas Ruprecht, I think is how you say it. Andreas Ruprecht, I'm not sure. Which I thought was a bit cheeky, a bit disappointing really, that he's using that guy as the source. There's no description, there's no link in the description of the video to buy the book, and he's referenced for less than 2 seconds. And as an ex-aviation journalist, and perhaps soon to be aviation journalist again, that kind of stuff really gets under my skin. So I would say to people, go ahead and watch the Millennium 7 History Tech video, enjoy it, thumbs up if you like it, give the guy your support. I think he's great. But if you really want to exercise some payback for the knowledge that you generate from watching that, then go and buy Andreas's book. It's not cheap, but that would be my suggestion. I think that would be the fair thing to do. Now, with that out the way, Starbaby, tell me, how do you feel about it? What do you think is the right thing, or whether, if it's not the right thing and it's not acceptable to go and train the Chinese, what is acceptable? Where do you draw the line between sort of being a mercenary and just being a capitalist?
Yeah, so I think it's a foul. There's not a whole lot of it depends here. If you are in any way contributing to the development of Chinese military aviation, you're on the wrong side of the fence. And for ex-Royal Air Force or, former U.S. Marine Corps, in the case of our Harrier pilot that got busted in Australia, that's a foul. I mean, it's not even close. There's no way you should be advising the Chinese in any capacity with respect to their military aviation. If you were teaching them to fly a better instrument approach in an Airbus A319, when there's so much pollution around that you're below 2 miles worth of visibility, I'm all for that. That's great. But giving any military assistance is definitely a foul. And there's a long tradition of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Department of Defense assisting Middle Eastern countries, the Saudis being among the most heinous, but they are still technically allies. So, while I'm not big fans of the Saudis, it wouldn't raise my hackles, right? They're technically an allied force. They get allied military equipment. They train in the United States. So it's not something that you wouldn't be going against U.S. government policy. But since neither the King's military nor the United States Department of Defense are in a defense relationship where they're training with the Chinese, that's just a foul. And I'm thrilled to see at least the U.S. Justice Department issuing an indictment.
What do you think? My supposition is that the building blocks of being a good pilot or fighter aircrew, if they're instilled in you, then by the time you do get to the B course or the FTU, you have more capacity and more likely to be successful in learning how to employ an aircraft as a weapon system. Is that a valid supposition? Do you think that there's some truth to that? I mean, what is the damage that these people may be causing?
Okay. So the damage is the People's Liberation Army and all of its branches. So remember, everything is a People's Liberation Army kind of function. And the PLA is a party military, not a professional military. And it's a party military that hasn't fought a large-scale war since the Korean War. Although it's had minor events, they did get their butts kicked by the Vietnamese in 1979. And there have been a couple exchanges over islands over the years. And of course, they did successfully invade Tibet. But they don't have institutional knowledge on how to fight tactically, how to organize themselves operationally. And we have none of our citizens, or in the Royal Air Force's case, subjects, have any business whatsoever uh, adding to any institutional knowledge that the People's Liberation Army doesn't have and needs. They can only help the Chinese and thereby hurt everybody else who might be a victim of Chinese aggression. And when you're looking at two countries like Russia and China that have a vested interest in destabilizing the post World War II order, because neither of them is on top of it, then you have to be extra cautious. So, yeah, I think they can provide some help. We'll see. We'll see what the indictment is. But even if, again, for somebody with a UK passport, you may not technically be in violation of the Official Secrets Act, but you're still assisting a potential adversary military.
Do you think it's okay to simply say, well, we live in a capitalist society. We are, free to make our choices. Certainly in the case of the MOD, we have Chinese students. A small number have come to Cranwell to go through the Air University that is there. And I know that in 2016 we apparently sent some fighter guys over to China to help them learn aviation English. But do you think that it's okay then, having set that tone, for someone to just say, well, look, if the Royal Air Force or whoever it is going to treat me badly and not take care of my financial security and not look after my future, which is the accusation that is regularly leveled against the RAF at least, that there's some sympathy that is deserved?
Yeah, so no, you get no sympathy there. The line there is that even if you are training Chinese pilots, and if we were training Chinese pilots, that's not a tactical kind of thing. That is teaching somebody the basics of aviation, and that is completely different from teaching somebody how to employ their aviation in supported military operations. This is not an easy, this is really a very easy dividing line. Okay, training somebody in aviation skills, fine. Training somebody combat aviation skills, not fine.
Let's see whether or not there's any commentary from the chat before we move on then. So
yeah, Sedlo does say, in today's friends might be tomorrow's enemies, which is an excellent point. You should also remember that today's enemies could be tomorrow's friends, but if they are, we can train them then, not now while they're still today's enemies.
Well, that's the obvious link, isn't it? So we were just talking about the question was, how do you rebuild Ukraine's Air Force? There was some touching upon where they are now in terms of the complexity around teaching guys to fly, and girls, to fly complex fast jets. And the obvious thing that we didn't really talk about, and I was waiting until we'd had this conversation, was whether or not you could have contractors, whether or not you could get a force of Gripens. I mean, if we go right back an hour ago, we were talking about technical overmatch between the AA-13 and the R-27, and okay, we'll give them some Gripens, put Meteor on it, get some contract pilots to come in, and then you've got the question of, okay, well, how? Because if we think back a year and a half, let's say, and the way some media outlets were talking about Ukraine, and how some political entities in both of our countries viewed Ukraine, that's changed quite a bit now they've been invaded. Where will it be where will the sympathies lie? How will we view them when the war is over? And what will happen to all the weaponry and the training that we gave them? So you kind of end up back in the same conversation.
Yeah, so you end up in a conversation anytime you're dealing with that, and we have had some notable losses, like the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The only guys to fly Tomcats, and they're still flying their Tomcats. But remember that there's two issues here. One, if you're going to go with the contract pilot route, which is not a stupid idea, you still also have to go with contract maintenance. Somebody needs to foot the bill for that, and you actually have to enlist those people in the Ukrainian armed forces in order to make that work legally. Otherwise, they are definitely mercenaries, and that is a law of armed conflict issue, um, and a Geneva Convention issue. So that's a tough challenge there.
Although I'm not sure the Russians really would make a distinction anyway, the way they have apparently treated some of the genuine members of the Ukrainian armed forces who are sort of expatriates in the UK or the US and have been in their armed forces.
Yeah, but
for
there's
some
no
time.
point in making it any easier for them. The
point.
fact is that, yes, while again, the Russian treatment of POWs is absolutely war crime, um, the don't make it easier for them to justify war crimes in the international community, and flying mercenaries is one of them. Plus, I actually think U.S. law they wouldn't be U.S. mercenaries, unless, of course, the U.S. hires them, like your Blackwater, and then, Blackwater Enterprises, losing the war one unnecessary civilian casualty at a time. So I've seen those guys and their clown act in the field too. So,
Yeah.
not a good advertisement for mercenaries, really.
Okay, let's move on because we've got a ton of AMAs. One quick question for you. B-21, what do you reckon? Give us your
All I
speculation.
know about the B-21, and I don't know it, I just have a high confidence, is that there will be a B-52 flyby for the B-21's retirement.
It's almost a certainty, isn't it?
Yep.
You get no points for being right on that one.
Sorry.
Okay, so let's go to the AMA. So, Exchequer has asked, would the F-14 have made a good CD platform, even supplanting the mighty CJ or the other two-seater platform?
No, because it had its radar warning gear was trash.
You could have changed that. Though.
So at the time, you would have had to do the kind of renovation that you ended up doing with the F4G. And then in that case, if you had an ECMO in the back, and harms on the wing stations, and an actual receiver processor unit designed for targeting, it might have made a fine weasel. But that's like, great. If Scooby-Doo vans could fly, then you could fit 4 people in them and they'd be a prowler.
Okay, that might have to go on a T-shirt. I don't know. Gravel King. Okay. So he's asking, in light of recent efforts to damage the Ukrainian infrastructure with saturation attacks using cheap and dumb drones, are we to expect to see more of that in future conflicts? And do you think Iran can produce enough drones? Oh, we're back to Ukraine again. This is in the wrong section. This should have been a Ukrainian question, but let's go with it anyway. Do you think you can build enough drones to make them impactful? And are we going to see drone wars as the way ahead?
We're going to see drone wars as part of the way ahead. The problem with drone wars in this particular case is they're not working. It is in no way diminishing Ukrainian military capability. It is causing additional pain for the population, and they're not going to give in because of it. So it's just another means of doing your air-delivered terror attack. And because of that, low-end practitioners who think that they were going to be the first to make an air-delivered terror attack work are going to try it out. That means, however, that Western nations have to be prepared for this, and we have to get off our high-cost interceptor against low-cost drone model. Because, you take a look at a surface-to-air missile, and it's going to engage everything from a hovering helicopter to, potentially a fast jet pulling lots of Gs, with ECM. That is a broad range. That means an expensive interceptor. If you're going for a drone that's under 200 knots, or you want to target just a helicopter or something like that, that would be great. One of the problems the U.S. has is that we have no research and development infrastructure that's really designed to support a rapid turn. I mean, I literally know a guy with an interceptor design that could probably be built in a mom and pop machine shop out of commercially available chips for the flight control system. And the guy I'm talking about basically works for a U.S. government asset, and there's no there's no process. Who can he send that to? Who can he ask for money? How can we field it? So we're not only seeing a failure to anticipate this threat, which is going to continue to be a threat, but we're seeing a devolution of national industrial and research capability that has been a long slide since Vietnam, whereby we're not prepared to react to this kind of thing in short notice. So there will be more, and Ukraine won't be the only victim. And we have to not only come up with some solutions, but we need to posture so that we can come up with rapid solutions for the next whole card that somebody slams down on the table.
It does raise an interesting question around ownership, doesn't it? I mean, I'm sort of thinking back to the sort of Vietnam era where there was the tussle between, or potentially I'm not sure if it's a tussle or if it was just a disagreement around who would own close air support, whether it would be the Air Force or the Army, and then the Air Force got the A-10, so they stayed with it. And I just wonder, thinking about Loyal Wingman, that kind of very high-tech program, I think there's some evidence elsewhere that the Air Force in behind closed doors has been investing in that sort of serious technology quite heavily. Do you think that the anti-drone piece should be owned by the Army or the Air Force? Because you're not going to use Loyal Wingman against the Shaheed.
Right. So in U.S. doctrine, ground-based air defense belongs to the U.S. Army. I would not leave this up to the U.S. Army because they have no interest in ground-based air defense. So I would say that in terms of the U.S. Department of Defense, the first guys to come up with a process that can field the system should freaking field the system, and you worry about who controls it later.
It does matter because it's funding, though, doesn't it? I mean, it's got to come out of somebody's purse. So does it not really matter first who owns it, and then second what it is?
Yes, but when you look at, like, for example, the Quick Strike ER, Quick Strike J, which are precision aerial delivered mines, that's a Navy mission. They manage all the mine warfare stuff. But delivery of mines is also a bomber mission. And since the quick strikes are derived from JDAM bodies, the bombers are pretty much ready to plug and play. But the initial funding for Quick Strike ER was a couple of 06s at Pacific Air Forces, myself included, going to General Carlisle, the 4-star, and getting $400,000 to do a demo. And so the Air Force did the first demo for a Navy mission that is now a Navy, and did the first flight tests for a Navy weapon that is now operational in the U.S. Navy and employable by the U.S. Air Force, and it did not come through Navy processes. And we did that, $400,000, 5 months. Getting the ball rolling should not worry about a service lane. That's one of our problems.
All right. So Single Sprocket has asked a non-aviation question, which is cool. So he talks about how you were vocal about your love for the F4G, but what cars did you drive?
Oh, yeah, this is a great question. So, man, this is not embarrassing because I'm quite pleased with it. Okay, so this is the whole aviator car thing. And when you go to pilot training or nav training, you're really getting a paycheck for the first time in your life that what didn't involve you working food services on work study at college, right? So, chances are you weren't making huge piles of cash, and you're going to go out and buy a car. And so we see the Mustangs, and maybe we see a Corvette, and people who are prior enlisted and already have families, they're way more practical. But in the 90s, the car was the Ford Explorer, the SUV kind of thing, despite the fact that you would never go off-road with it. The Ford Explorer was a thing, and we had a couple of guys with sports cars and so on. I drove a 1973 American Motors Hornet, possibly the most embarrassing fighter aviator car that wasn't a deliberate, let's be embarrassing choice. It was my college car. I got it with 10,000 miles on it for $200. I carried spare parts and tools in the trunk because I could fix it by the side of the road. And to make things extra painful for the rest of the squadron, I had a Nevada Phantom II license plate. And this thing would park in the squadron in the 90s, a 1973 American Motors Hornet. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hornet, you may remember, it might have been Live and Let Die, but it was a Roger Moore, I think, James Bond movie set somewhere down in the bayous, Louisiana, where a Hornet with a V8 makes the longest bridge jump, stunt jump ever. Okay, it's this ridiculous car with a long front end because you had to be able to fit a V8 in it, and this truncated back that they pretended was economical. American Motors Hornet. So yes, you can tell. There is a kind of thing, where you want to have a car. As you get older, plenty of aviators have to go to minivans, as embarrassing and humiliating as that is, but they will go back if they actually can. I'm not a car person. I drove a 73 Hornet till I was a mid-level captain. And then I transitioned to the minivan, and I went from the minivan to the Toyota Prius. And I'm now on my third Toyota Prius. And I will tell you that my Toyota Prius has a heads-up display, and it has a LiDAR, and it has a radar, and it gets 60 miles per gallon. And the color is actually called hypersonic red. I did not make that up. Because, you buy a Corvette, you can do 120 miles an hour. But where? You have to be out in the West someplace with no cops around. I could get 60 miles per gallon everywhere I drive. There you go. Toyota Prius. As we've already previously guessed, I'm kind of an outlier in this respect.
Okay, so speaking of outliers, Spectre Pilot, who just, I think he might end up coming in on the channel for an interview if he ever gets his act together. But he's just giving me shit here because he's saying, Starbaby, what's the NATO nomenclature for Steve's upper lip? Snot mop is what he's asking.
Oh, well, the first thing I thought was porn stash. But I can't do any better than that. I mean, I think if you look through the comments, there's a couple comments on there.
Oh,
and
surely not.
Yes, there are, and there are some memes forthcoming. So I'm going to leave that to our resident artists and humorists to dissect that particular little caterpillar-like thing.
Brilliant. Well, look, this is only a few days 10 days of growth. I mean, the next time we do one, it will be bushy and wholesome and fully impressive.
Yeah, but because you're a Brit, you have to wax it. It's traditional. You have little curly ends, little wax
That's
thing.
the French. Like Poirot.
You stole it from the French. Come on, look at any Royal Air Force group captain during the Second World War.
True. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, I take your point. Okay, anyone tuning in at this point is going to think, what is this? I thought I was tuning in to hear about modern air power. Clearly not. Right. So Neuropilot, you've asked what the origins of the Starbaby call sign are. Starbaby does in one of our videos explain that. I think it's Wild Weasel 3. I'll put a link in the description anyway afterwards.
No, it might be the cockpit tour.
Might be the cockpit tour. Okay, one of the videos he answers that. So I won't ask the question because he's already answered it, but we'll move on to the next one, which is Jester's asking, have the Russians got Link 16? He's also asking if they're utilising the A50. We've already talked about that. But have the Russians got data link?
Yes, they've had data link for decades.
Any good?
I have no idea how it works. They actually have, or they advertise a unified series of data links. So the Air Force has a data link, and the Army Ground Forces has a data link, and the Air Defense Forces had their separate data link, and they are now supposed to be all compatible. And I can't remember the Russian name for it. But indications are in Ukraine that their data link system has not been working as well as it's advertised. And if it's like their radios, because they never load the crypto or they didn't put all the good components in it to begin with, I wouldn't expect their data link to work much better. However, remember that when the Russians have had data link for a very long time in their fighters, because that was how they received electronic instructions from ground control intercept radars. That was a direct couple to indicators in the airplane, and in some cases to the autopilot, where essentially the aircraft was being flown from the ground. The U.S. had the same thing. We had the semi-automatic ground environment, SAGE, and the F-102, F-106, the Air Defense Command, when we still had an Air Defense Command interceptors. Data link's a long-standing thing. Everybody's got data link. The TIEs have their own national data link alongside Link 16, built by Ericsson, a Swedish company. Yeah, it's a thing.
Okay, so here's a great question. Thoughts on the E3 today and the E7? So with radars, this is from Jester, with radars in fighters being what they are today with ACER, etc., what does an E7 rather bring to the table? And is the E3 today pretty much kaput?
Well, so the E3 is not kaput. I mean, the E3 has undergone some steady upgrades, but you're still doing a lot of upgrades to a design that is really 1960s, 1970s kind of technology baseline. Obviously, it's been upgraded, and the British E3Ds are pretty good. Um, but what the Wedgetail brings along is it brings along an airliner that is not a Boeing 707 as your airframe. So something that's going to be in production for a long period of time and is literally everywhere. And it brings modern design capabilities into the radar that were, a pipe dream back when the original E3A was developed. So you're getting significant more capability and a lot more computational power compared to the E3. So the E3 is not dead, but it's definitely kind of getting close to sunset.
Okay. Ghost Dog has asked, politics aside, are there any weapons from NATO nations that you wished you'd seen brought into the US inventory? For example, ASRAM, Meteor, Alarm. And if there are, why?
So the short answer is no. The Japanese AA4B, I'd have liked to see us experiment with it, the active AIM 7. But I would definitely like to see components of weapon systems come in. Like, for example, the French have been developing a solid fuel ramjet that I think would be spiffy as an air-to-air missile motor. And so that there's potential there. They're probably well ahead of U.S. industry in that particular area. So it's not that I can't think of any European weapon that I've been particularly jonesing for over my life, keeping in mind that the Joint Strike Missile is a European weapon and we already have it. So, and the Naval Strike Missile, European weapon. So it's not that there aren't features that I like, but I didn't see any, I don't have any mental need to say, oh man, I really wish I had that particular weapon. I don't. I really wish I had the all-around situational awareness that the Rafale was supposed to get in terms of the missile launch sensors, but apparently portions of that didn't live up to expectations, so I can't even say I want that.
Not impressed with Meteor then?
How does it beat an AMRAAM?
It's longer range, doesn't it? Much longer range.
Does it?
Well, I mean, we've got, Jane's figures, Wikipedia figures, open source figures would suggest that it does.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that. And can it make use of its longer range? And what does it pay? How does it pay for that? I just don't know enough.
Fair enough.
If as a derivation for a longer range air-to-air missile, it might be a good baseline.
I think the US has the AIM to, I don't even know what the designation is, the new sort of AMRAAM that's very secret, AIM 236 or something like that. It's supposed to...
Right. Also, the Boeing's modular air-to-air missile, which is neat. I think those would be neat too.
Yeah.
But I'd need to know more about them. And if I knew more about them, I probably couldn't say a thing. So I kind of stuck.
Here's something you should be able to say plenty about. So Paladin 1CD asked, I'd love to hear about some of the hijinks and traditions of the units that you're in. I'm sure that aircrew mess with each other and such. And can you share some of those stories? Make it brief. Don't go on for hours.
Lunches. Okay, so you can go. I was introduced to this in the 81st Fighter Squadron, Spangdahlem, Germany, where you have a lunch fridge. So you would typically have like a beer fridge and a lunch fridge, and you stash your lunch in the fridge because plenty of guys bring lunch from home. You don't necessarily have time to eat something else, and you don't want to go for a Diet Coke and Snickers bar for every meal because you already had those for breakfast. And so there were the guys in the squadron who would take a bite out of your sandwich and put it back. And so you would just go there and there would be a bite out of your sandwich. We don't really mess with each other's flight gear, but there are things that might happen TDY. Um, like I remember a bunch of guys. I mean, I typically go to bed early and I don't drink, so I'm usually well rested. And I had a bunch of guys, throwing like tomatoes at my windows in the queues in Turkey. And I had the roulades down. So it's not like they're going to hurt anything. And where they got a bunch of tomatoes, I don't know. But nevertheless, I went to sleep. But I identified by the voices, and in the case of Skip Jacoby, some giggling as to who the perpetrators were. And so I pretty much the next day declared that there would be revenge. But Skip, I had to forego my revenge because I stepped to the jet one day without my helmet, and he had to bring it out to me, so I had to give it up in order to get him to deliver my helmet to me. But Dennis Malfer, again, one of my favorite pilots, I just waited for Dennis. And I had a Ziploc bag full of finely crushed saltine crackers, and I waited for the day he left his door unlocked. And he left his door unlocked, and I snuck in, and I left the bag of saltine crackers in the bag on top of his pillow to remind him of what could have happened. Okay, now that I had access to his bed, and like all of his clothing and everything in his little queue room. So that was a word to the wise, and Malf is smart enough to take that. The issues were not repeated. So the kind of standard stuff you would see: you'd take a guy's hat, you put it in the freezer, um, or you save it, till you can throw it on a bar and have somebody else's hat on the bar, so he has to buy drinks. That's all normal stuff. Dining ins, formal events, the grog bowl. There's really too much to list. But yes, we have them. Some of them cause embarrassment, some of them don't, and some of them are just traditional. We imported a lot from the Royal Air Force. Some of our traditions are derived from the Royal Air Force, and even the RAF doesn't know why they do them.
I wanted to ask, there's a particular question that was asked of you. I'm trying to find it. Around an article you wrote, I think in 2014. Was it 2014?
Comanche and the Albatross.
That was it, yeah. So the question, I'm sorry, I don't remember. It's somewhere down here. I don't remember who it was who asked the question, but can you talk a little bit about that? What was the article? And we don't have to go into the subject in detail. We can come back to that and do it another time. But what was it that prompted you to write it? And, how does that fit in with your philosophy around writing in general?
Oh, well, so the Air Force Chief of Staff at the time had been talking about the F-35 and said, yeah, not a great airplane, but we have no choice. And I thought that was bullshit. So I wrote in Air and Space Power Journal an article called The Comanche and the Albatross. The Comanche being an Army stealth helicopter that was canceled, and the Albatross being the whole Samuel Taylor Coleridge Rime of the Ancient Mariner thing, with the albatross around your neck just kind of dragging you down. The curse, as it were. And I laid out an article saying, of course, we had a choice, that we had made the wrong design decisions with the F-35, that we had paid too much attention to stealth. And I published it in an Air Force document, and, written by an 06. And my writing philosophy, a lot of my professional writings, because remember, this was part of my duty at the time on the Chief Strategic Studies Group or a number of other locations, was that I would often write in response to something that somebody had said publicly that was stupid or wrong. And I had to dig into it, but I had to do the research because, sometimes where I start an article is not where I end up in the article. And, the question was I punished for it? Yeah, sort of, but nothing officially. I was punished in that I was told to stop writing for a couple of months while I was in the Pacific. And, my next evaluation was good, but my recommendation for promotion was a do not promote.
Oh, really?
I didn't even get a debrief on that one, by the way. I didn't know it until I actually saw the form after the board. That's the cost of doing business. Nails that stick up get hammered.
So you would have been an 05? You would have been a lieutenant colonel? So
no, I was a colonel at the time. That was my promotion recommendation for 07.
Oh, you would have maybe got a star. Did you have
a
GEO sponsor? Okay.
Yeah, so realistically, there was no way I was going to get a star. So that's why I'm not really wrapped up about it. Do not promote. It's a blow to my ego more than it was a blow to my career path, because I was in the reserve system, and the reserves quite reasonably wants their general officers to be experts in the reserve system, and I'm not. I don't know anything about it. And so all the qualities that I think got me to '06 are exactly the qualities you do not want in your '07 Corps. It had been fun and it had been ego, but there are also no good one-star jobs either. So I know two guys I used to fly with who've turned it down.
Really?
Yeah, because there were no good one-star jobs and they didn't expect to get one. So it's if it's your ambition to have a star, um, then that's all well and good. That was never one of my ambitions. It's another way to feed my ego, but it wasn't a big deal. I mean, getting an oak leaf was great. Getting eagles was extra spiffy. A star, I get a flag.
Okay, so Book and Can Man 83. By the way, he's sent a donation to the channel. That's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Absolutely not necessary. I do have a buy me a coffee function, which I think I'll put in the description if you did want to make a donation. Thank you very much. But thank you for the donation. Has asked why the Russians haven't used the MiG-29, MiG-35 more. So I know we're flip-flopping back between Ukraine in general, but I wanted to ask this question because they did make a donation. Not that I want to encourage people to make a donation in order to get their question asked. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I just felt it was the right thing to do. So let me ask one more.
Obligated.
That's the last Ukraine question, and then we'll finish off with our non-Ukraine questions. But anyway, why has the MiG-25 seemingly been absent?
Okay, so which MiGs are we talking about? Because you've mentioned three.
MiG-29 and the 35, which I think is the modernized version of the MiG-29. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the only reason those aircraft are kept around by the Russians is for foreign military sales purposes. I don't think they would add anything operationally. I think that is a case where they don't need it for anything. They have better air-to-air options, and the MiG-29 is a crappy air-to-ground option. So that's I would not have expected them to fund those squadrons to be any more than the aerial demonstration team. And I've seen the MiG-29 aerial demonstration team. Not bad for a bunch of drunks. But yeah, I would not expect them to see that because I think that's a foreign military sales tool.
Yeah. It's another t-shirt.
That was my exact phrasing at the time when I saw them.
We need a picture of Jack's chief meme officer. We need a picture of some of the swans or the swallows, I think they're called, and then that quote. Not bad for a bunch of drunks. Brilliant. Okay, so there we go. So that makes perfect sense. All right, back to our other questions, and I think we'll probably do sort of another 10-15 minutes and then wrap it up. Give everybody enough time to hit the like button. Hint, hint. So let's go back down to our list here. So I didn't understand this. Chris935 has asked: is CityDesk the worst call sign ever, or has there been an even worse one? What's CityDesk? Who was CityDesk? I have
no idea.
Okay, I didn't bother googling.
No,
it, so
and it's not the worst call sign ever.
Okay, and it was Chris who'd asked about the Comanche and the Comanche and the Albatross. So there we go. But what was the worst call sign ever then?
I think FI is probably the worst call sign ever.
FI.
Yep. Second word, idiot.
Say again.
The second letter stands for idiot.
So so I think he's talking about flight call signs, or maybe he's
not.
I don't
flight
know.
Call sign.
I don't know now. Now I'm confused because So Fifi.
Okay,
so Fifi doesn't stand for F idiot. So I'm not going to say what it stands for because she's coming on the channel in 3 days' time. I'm recording my interview.
Yeah, good.
She'll tell
let
the story
Fifi
of her
explain
call
her call sign. No, that's totally unrelated to Fifi. Okay, so fighter call signs. Fighter call signs should have one or two syllables. So anything longer than that is complex. So CityDesk, I mean, who would have thought of that? So there was a question in earlier, that came up on Discord is how do you assign aircraft call signs? So this is all in the air tasking order. And the simple way to do it is to have one of your advanced team list the call signs you want to use, in that particular theater for that particular operation for your type of aircraft. The smart way to do this is to have a rotating random number puller, but that was not an easy capability, back in the 90s. So it wasn't done. So, for example, The Weasels, because of Beagle Keck, were the beer call signs. A111s were tools. Tankers were sharks and predators. The Eagles were gas stations, that kind of thing. And so uh, when Bud and Course Flight bagged our SA-3 in northern Iraq, I had been the advanced team, so that's why the Strike Eagles were flying under Bud and Coors. And the Prowlers were flying under things like Harley, Bobo, and Whacker. I don't know. They must have skipped the meeting or something like that. So there may be themes, and it all comes out, but it's all on the air tasking order. And your call sign should be no more than 2 syllables because you don't want to have to say multi-syllable word break left because it's just too much of a problem. And so City Desk. Are you kidding me? I would not. I would have scrubbed that freaking mission. I don't even care what it was doing.
I'm wondering now if it's a person's call sign. I don't know. I often feel like on Discord, maybe it's just because I'm old and disconnected from life in general. But a lot of the stuff that goes on there, I don't understand it. I just think I'm missing. I didn't even know what a cat was the other day.
Yeah, and that's still reverberating. So it's actually the thing wearing a olive helmet right behind you right now.
Okay, let's move on. Let's ask another question then. So this is very topical. So Loco had asked the question. God, it's gone missing. Lucky I remember what it was. Loco asked the question about the announcement that the Kadena Eagle squadrons, there's 2 Eagle squadrons at Kadena,
yeah.
they're going to, I don't know if they're going to shut down, deactivate, or if they're going to go somewhere else, but at any rate, there's going to be a rotation into Kadena by other Air Force fighter units. Thoughts?
This is moronic, but it's a result of a series of bad Air Force decisions on their force structure. So you can the official national security strategy is that we're kind of focused on the Pacific. That has never been true, even though that started under President Obama, because there was always something happening in the Middle East or now in Europe that drew our attention. And so to say, hey, we're emphasizing the Pacific and we don't really have the base structure we want, but we're going to shut down one of our fighter wings and we're going to man it with rotational assets is insanely foolish. But it's not clear to me that the Air Force had any other easy options. The other thing that is feeding this narrative is the F-15EX. The obvious solution to this problem is to deploy the first 2 F-15EX squadrons into Kadena, but the F-15EX is going to the National Guard, where they can sit in Oregon and defend Oregon against Chinese bombers. Okay, again, a ridiculously stupid, politically motivated, let's get some airplanes by buying off the Guard and a state congressional delegation with them. And that is definitely affecting the strategy. So if your Eagles are not flyable, because you haven't invested in them, or they're just old, or you cut your Strike Eagle by. All of these things happened. These are all a series of bad decisions that have national security implications because we don't have the force to do it. We should, if you want to pivot to the position, we should have 3 squadrons at Kadena, not 2. And they should be something with range and payload, and that means F-15 or E or F-15EX.
Do you think that the EX decision is could it be challenged? Have those decisions been made? Has the money been sunk? Is there any opportunity to?
Of course, it could be changed.
What does it take? Or what would it take?
It would take the Secretary of Defense to say, "Yeah, you're not doing this," and we'd have to be able to get it through the appropriate congressional wickets, because there's some people that are going to be pissed in Oregon that their Air Guard unit might lose the flying mission. They might lose some jobs. In this case, I would say that's too damn bad. But a that's too damn bad excuse does not work when you're the Department of Defense talking to Congress. Congress controls the purse strings. Purse strings. Purse springs are what happens when you drop your purse and it bounces back up again.
The conversation about range and payload reminds me of a comment somebody made on Discord. They just put B-52. There you go. That's what you need. 2 squadrons of B-52, range and payload.
Yes, but you still want them in like Australia and Guam. Okay, done. Yeah. Or Hawaii.
Okay.
The B-52 with the new engines, I mean, they can reactivate Castle Air Force Base and they can still fly to the far end of the theater. Yeah, for their B-21 flyby, whatever.
All right, let's go to see if we can get any questions. I'm just looking at my list here. That's a question. Why is the background back to front? Someone told me about that about 2 minutes in. I can't do anything about it. I'd need to go into my Zoom settings. Did you notice my background was back to front when we got
Not
together?
back to front on my display.
It's not back to front on your display. Weird. I don't know what's going on. Sorry then. It looks okay to us. Don't know why. Maybe my broadcasting software is...
Oh, you're right.
is
On
flipping it.
YouTube.
Yeah. Is it on
it's
YouTube?
flipping it.
Weird. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, so why is my background back to front? Because I've got something wrong. There we go. All right. So here you go. So T Zebra asks, non-OPSEC question, could you dump your fills under G? What does that mean? Is that another thing?
So the fills are our crypto fills.
Okay.
And I suppose you could. I don't know why you'd want to. So, and it would depend on which aircraft you were flying, right? Because the KY-58 zero eyes button on the F4 was down between your legs. So I wouldn't want to try that under G because I'd be bouncing my face off the stick. But yes, there's most of what you can reach at 1G, you can reach at a bunch of Gs, with the exceptions of like the circuit breakers in the F4 or the right or left. But you turn around. I mean, you do things.
I would have interpreted that question to mean, could the circuitry go, to shit under G? Something touch something else because of the, the G loading or something like that. I guess these devices were built to withstand typical loads.
Yeah, they're built and tested for an aircraft environment. I wouldn't. I mean, if I had accidentally brought my pocket electromagnetic pulse generator into the cockpit and set it off accidentally, I might dump my fills then. But I always left my pocket EMP generator in life support.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, good thing.
Okay, Jeffrey McQuate. This is a cool question. At what range would a MiG-29 Raw pick up a long-range shot? It's kind of a trick question, isn't it?
It depends. Okay, so the MiG-29 Raw is a SPO-15. The SPO-15 is not a great radar warning receiver. It's designed to tell you kind of the category of radar that's doing its thing, and it's really designed to tell you if there's a target lock. So if I'm on high data rate Twiz slinging AMRAAMs, I don't think they're going to get a clue unless it's programmed to detect the AMRAAM radar. And by the time the AMRAAM comes on and turns on the radar, now you're pretty much in a world of hurt. You're going to have a hard time completing a avoidance maneuver, particularly because the SPO-15 does not really give you good enough situational awareness to do the kind of Western defense maneuvers that our fighters do. Your normal fighter's roar is not great, but it's better than a SPO-15.
I think that's one of the things that they reference in the Rusi article as well, isn't it? The fact there's no indication for the Ukrainians that they're being targeted, and whereas with the R-27 you'd have to have a lock, so the Russians will get an indication. So okay, but
that's that. But for an R-27, you're in single target track. A flash dance can shoot out of a number of potential modes and add range, and so the SPO-15 may not recognize that particular mode.
I think one or two last questions, Starbaby, then. So Gorio Productions had asked what the general consensus was on low-level regime and its evolution since the Gulf War. I think we touched on that a little bit, but probably given the nature of our conversation so far today and the fact that the Ukrainians had to go low-level, it might be worth a quick summary from your point of view. How has it evolved? And I think he's also asking, do you get a sense from the current leadership in the Air Force what they're thinking?
Oh, I have no idea what the current leadership of the Air Force is thinking on low. If they're smart, they're thinking, we need to invest a whole lot more in low altitude. So back in the day for NATO, so in the 80s, everybody was low altitude guy. Okay? And like I pointed out before, is that nobody who flew low altitude in Europe, no matter how low they were, and no matter which Air Force they were in, everybody has the experience of a Royal Air Force fighter going underneath them when they thought they were at low altitude. And that was because of the threat environment. And we started out the Gulf War that way, and there were definitely some losses. And so, by day 3, certainly by day 7, some guys were late. We're all up at medium altitude. And so the Air Force came away with a lesson that we'll never go low again because we had all our losses at low altitude. But the Air Force misanalyzed its own data. What they didn't realize is that they did not lose an aircraft on ingress or egress at low altitude. They lost them in the target area when the factor was not so much low altitude as it was proximity to clustered air defenses, because these losses were very much around airfields. And so what they should have gotten out of it was airfield attack is dangerous when you go in close, and we have to be able to do standoff. And what the Air Force came out with was we can't go low. But they were still trying. I mean, remember, after the Gulf War, we were flying Block 40 Vipers with Lantern. They got the targeting pod and the nav pod. They had the terrain following radar. And the Block 40s were like the one-man F-16, except that Lantern went away. The nav pod went away on the Vipers because they killed too many of their dudes at night. Because it's not a great single-seat meeting. So we joked, because we're evil and we have black humor, about man turn in the Viper, medium altitude, targeting at night. And so everybody does some low altitude, but even in like the mid 2000s, I was at a conference at Maxwell Air Force Base, as a major, and I heard general officers saying, "Yeah, we're going to take the low altitude requirement away from the Strike Eagles." I said, "No, you're not. He's a standard Iron Major staff guy. You can't possibly support that. It'll never make it through the process because it's stupid, and here's why." And it's one of the rare cases where the facts, beat it. But now, having, flown at extremely low altitude in attempts to evade radar, I'm a big fan. And that is something I think we need to be training for, because if for no other reason than if you need it, you probably need it badly, and you better be trained for it. And so I'm hoping that one of the things that Ukraine teaches the United States is that we need to be proficient, and we need to be capable, and we need to have the systems to support operations at low altitude, particularly at night. I've got a couple articles on that in War on the Rocks, where I talk about low altitude. I think the series was called Stuck on Denial. And it starts out with attacking the stealth is everything, and goes to, hey, let's start rethinking low altitude.
Yeah.
So now I feel completely justified in those articles years later, because not only the Ukrainians going low, but the Russians have had to go low. Fortunately, the Russians suck at it.
Yeah. Okay, last question then. This is from Jester again. And again, if anybody's listening and they ask a question and they're disappointed they didn't get to hear the answer, then we will dump it into a thread on the Discord channel, which you should come and join if you want to see Starbaby answer it. And again, I'm not going to commit him to doing that. He did it last time, and if he has time, he'll do it again. But I'm sure you'll get an answer at some point.
I also tend to do it on the YouTubes too.
You do it on YouTube too. You shouldn't really, because anyway, it's up to you. You do what you want with your time.
Well, that's where where else can I find my Russian trolls to abuse?
Well, they haven't come to Discord. I'm not going to say I'm disappointed that they haven't come to Discord. I think one of the things that, philosophically from my point of view, would be good is to have some people challenge some of the things that are on the channel. I would love to interview a Russian. I'd love to get somebody who has experience flying with VKS to come on and talk about things from their perspective. I definitely would like to put a balanced view forward. But certainly those people who shit talk on YouTube haven't come to Discord so far. And I wouldn't have a problem with them coming to Discord so long as they don't make ad hominem attacks on people and they're not massively disruptive. But they should certainly come and share their viewpoint and be prepared to be countered on it. Anyway.
I don't know. Just having one gunship dude is massively disruptive. I don't know how worse you want it to get.
I know. I sort of kind of regret, inviting him now. So, all right, so the last question is going to be from Jester. So, have you ever face planted due to an unexpected maneuver? And is there a name or a word for that happening?
There's a word you say when it does happen. Yeah, so of course I have. So when you're learning to be a baby wizzo, baby Ewo, there's a couple things that you haven't adjusted to. There's the possibility that you're going to bounce your face off the stick, or actually there's a rubber radar hood in the F4, or you're going to slam your helmet against the side of the canopy. So that happens to everybody at some point because you don't have the ability when you're a young guy or gal to anticipate the onset of G or the sudden maneuvers. Once you get some more experience in the airplane, then it doesn't happen. You know what's going to happen, from the environment and from the movement of the stick. And of course, the stick moves before the anything else happens. So, yeah, it has happened. It happens to everybody, and then it's hard to do because you just learn. Your body learns. You don't even think about it.
Okay, on that note, let's have a quick update then on when we're talking to you next. So we're not going to do an AMA in December, I don't think. I think our next AMA is going to be the Weasel, the massive Weasel AMA. We're going to have to sort out some timing for that because we've got loads of questions, loads of interest on a dedicated Wild Weasel AMA. I'm not going to want to do it at exactly this time because it's now 10:15 in the evening for me, and even this is pushing things a little bit. So we'll have to figure out some timing, but we are committed to doing that, I think, in early January. I don't know if you and I have a date in the diary, so I won't announce it just yet. But for anybody listening, we'll get that done in January. We will, however, see you in December for the Star Wars BrevityCon, which is not going to be done live. We're pre-recording that. That's on Discord as well. If you're interested in coming along and being a voice actor, well, you'll need your image on the screen as well because we'll have video cameras and that kind of stuff up and running. So if you're interested in coming along and taking part in that, we don't actually need anybody else, but we have capacity for other actors to come along. So come and check out the Discord
Actors
channel.
who might only get one word.
Yeah, you may only get one word, but you'll be part of something great. So all that remains then is for me to say, Starbaby, thank you so much. I look forward to that. I'm really looking forward to the Weasel AMA, and we will resume the Starbaby AMAs, I guess, at the end of January. So we'll get back into that cadence. Thank you to everybody who's joined us for this, and thank you very much for thumbing it up and for taking part in the chat. Sorry if your question didn't get asked live. Thanks to Jax for doing the background, and thanks to the team on Discord and here Nux and Exchequer today who have helped to farm out some of those questions to me on my Word document in my iPad here. And have a great weekend, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Alrighty. Veterans Day.
Yeah, happy Veterans Day. Cheers.
See y'all.